Moving right along, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome Mr. Walt Duflock, the Vice President of Innovation for Western Growers. And Walt, I've just gotten to know over the last couple of years, but man, he's a powerhouse in the realm of agriculture and specifically agricultural technology. And nothing more need be said about the importance of agriculture to the Central Coast economy. So, Walt, the floor is yours.
Cool.
See your
Thanks, Josh.
okay,
Sorry.
good.
There we go. Got the screen in the right spot. Hi, folks. So I'm the SVP of Innovation for Western Growers. Our focus is on a lot of the specialty crop growers that grow the fruits, nuts, and vegetables that so many of us eat all the time. And I wanted to open with a quick problem statement. What tees up the opportunity for ag and ag tech are really the challenges that the specialty crop ag industry is facing. And I wanted to call out two. There are more than this. This is kind of the top two that our growers keep reminding us all the time are the biggest challenges. Yes, there's water. Yes, there's food safety. Yes, there's other stuff. But at a high level, I think the two biggest opportunities, and these are the two we're focused on at Western Growers for the innovation team, are really crop and soil health and then labor. So if we start with crop and soil health, there's a lot of pests and pathogens that have a big impact on specialty crops. Just to give you guys some quick numbers, 20 to 40% of crops get lost to pests. This is, global problem, right? 220 billion to disease, 70 billion to pests. And at the same time, all these disease and pest impacts are happening. There's massive regulatory pressure on chemicals to both ban them and reduce their usage. And there's reduced efficacy as the pathogens and the pests mutate and become more resistant to these products. That causes a reduced efficacy. So you've got some challenges with chemistry, both on the regulatory front, and they get less effective over time. And really, if you think about the three main regions that are putting the pressure on the chemistry, these are not, small markets. These are the EU, these are the US market, and this is the California market specifically. So those three government groups are putting massive pressure on the chemistry side of the business for agriculture, leading to some of those numbers. And while we have biological solutions, as we'll touch on in a minute, they're not quite ready for prime time. On the labor side, you've got a couple of things going on at the same time. Costs are increasing. Labor's getting harder to find. It's a global problem, which sort of feeds itself. And so just to give you a quick taste of the numbers, Cal Poly did the study, some research from Lynn Hamilton in the Ag Econ department. We saw an 8x lift in regulatory costs, just the regulatory compliance costs on a per acre per year basis in 12 years. So that went from 109 to 977 per acre per year. We saw a reduced domestic workforce that resulted in a 7 times lift in H2A workers, the international farm workers, over 17 years. That's gone from 48,000 to 371,000, or roughly 15% of the total farm workforce. And all of those H2A workers require two massive costs for the growers: housing to put the workers in and transportation to move the workers around. So these are some big numbers that are out there and some big costs. Again, this is what drives the automation need for the growers. So that's the problem statement for the two big ones. Let's go to the next slide. No, this is the venture capital landscape for agri-food tech, and I wanted to call attention to two things. So it's a nice up and to the right chart for the last roughly 10 years, from 3.1, kind of 2.3 billion down that early phase, the 2012, 2013 phase, all the way up to a high water mark of 53 billion in 2021. So what drove all that growth? Well, much of it was started when Monsanto acquired Climate Corp for $1 billion back in 2013. And that pushed the number up and up and up. And then other segments came into play. Folks realized there were some problem statements. Thus, we got to the 53.2. So that explains the growth over 10 years, a nice big acquisition, some real problems to solve. Founders and investors react. We get to 53 billion. and it's about half behind the farm gate, so on the farm, and about half on the way to the customer from the farm gate in terms of investment and entrepreneur. What happened in 2022? We went down to less than 30 billion, massive haircut, right? Down to under 30 billion. Two things happened. Controlled environment ag, the vertical farming space, got way overhyped, way over its skis. And the alternative protein space, Impossible Meat and Beyond Burger, got way over their skis as well. And I think the same thing happened in both categories. Folks forgot that you're competing with Taylor Farms, Driscoll's Berries, JBS, and the livestock folks for shelf space and mind share of the customer. And that forgetfulness led to some really silly checks getting written for large amounts. That now corrected down to 30 billion. So steady state, I believe the number will be closer to that 29 billion this year in 23, and the 53 billion will be an outlier. So that's a risk factor for the startups that got funding back in that 2018-19 timeframe. But it's definitely, there's still money out there compared to where we were 10 years ago. So that's the venture landscape for where we're at. Let's look at the next slide. I just wanted to call out two specific categories. The solutions to these problems are both biotech, in the case of chemistry, the biological alternatives to chemistry, I think are the most exciting. We'll spend 2 slides talking about that in a minute. It was number 2 behind novel farming systems, which actually included both the CEA, the controlled environment stuff, and the alternative protein. So that's not going to be number 1 going forward. That took a big haircut. The ag biotech will be number 1, I predict, for the next 3 to 5 years. It's a great space. The automation side of the business is really the farm robotics, the red down there, and a lot of the farm management and software up on line 3. So I think the automation category is going to move into the number 3 or 4 position the next couple of years. It's the only solve for labor that we really have. So that's kind of the landscape for the 2 segments we're talking about. Let's go to the next slide. This is some work that we did with the Mixing Bowl, Rob Trice's group, and Pam Marone, one of the leaders in the biological space. This is the ag biologicals landscape, and this is out there. I'll try and put the link in the chat once I'm done with my slide set real quick. But the ag biologicals landscape basically identified 2 main areas. The biocontrol group, the pesticides group up on the top right in the big circle, the biostimulant group designed for yield growth on the bottom left. This is out of a consideration set of 1,200 startups that we identified. This is 400 of the vetted startups in these 2 main categories. And this space is only getting bigger. Again, it's the 2nd highest funding last year. Or in 2022, it's going to be, I think, the highest in 2023 and probably going forward. So you'll see more companies on this list. We'll be updating this list and probably splitting it out into 2 halves for those 2 categories in the next 12 to 18 months. The other thing to note is strategic buyers like Bayer, Syngenta, and the like are finding a better ROI on M&A and investment than they are on R&D. It's super hard to get the ROI on R&D these days for these companies because there's such long development cycles, the talent is so expensive, and it's just not their risk profile. They just don't like the risk portfolio that comes with new product design. Therefore, we're seeing an uptick in both these spaces, biologicals and automation, in willingness to write checks for investment and write checks for M&A, and we expect that to continue. Also worth noting on biologicals, we have known IP paths. We know how to get IP and intellectual property protected. We know how to value it from chemistry. All of that math, all of that experience lines up well for biologicals. So if there's one space that everyone in the entrepreneurial spot should be thinking about for ag tech, it is biologicals. The space is on fire and solving a real problem. Next slide. So how big is this problem? Well, Shane Thomas ran some numbers. He does upstream ag insights. He's one of the gurus in this space. Pam Marone likes him, and she's a guru herself. So I give Shane full marks, and I read his stuff all the time. He ran the math, and he asked the question, when are biologicals going to catch up to chemistry? Short version is, he says by 2043, biologicals, which starts at $10 billion, and chemistry, which starts at $61 billion, based on current growth rates and current projections, are both going to be around $114 billion in 2043. So it's a monster opportunity to capture this biological share of the market. And two things could accelerate that, and both are probably likely to happen. Regulating faster from the EU, US, and California markets would reduce chemistry faster, push the need for biology even harder. And if the biological efficacy increases, that would also shorten this time frame. So I talked to Shane actually last week in anticipation of this and a couple other presentations I'm doing. Shane believes this number is already coming in by about 3 to 5 years. So he thinks it's 2030 something when this happens, and that's a big crossover date to keep an eye on. So that's biologicals. Let's go to the next slide. This is the crop robotics landscape. This is the automation equivalent of the ag biologicals landscape. Again, Mixing Bowl did this. They do a great job with these. This is all of the robots laid out by autonomy, crop management, and harvest, left to right, for different types of growing environments on the left. And you can see, I called out the bullet points on the right to basically call your attention to a couple areas where I think the action is happening at a good pace. Robot weeding, robot thinning, robot planting, and robot harvest assist with products like Burrow. Those are all happening and gaining traction in the marketplace. And we saw Burrow just get a $24 million fundraise closed and announced today, which is great. And the key is they're gaining traction because they're doing the work as the grower expects and at economics that work for the grower. That is the key to this entire space. Meanwhile, harvest, which is the source of a lot of labor in basically the Central Coast area with ag and statewide and region-wide, strawberries can be a 6-month harvest season in most cases, right? So harvest is the big nut for a lot of this. It's also the hardest automation problem to solve. It's a little easier to destroy weeds and destroy plants when thinning than it is to actually pick a fruit, pick a veg, and deliver it whole product to the customer via retail. So the ones on the top are where the action's happening. You guys might have heard the names Carbon Robotics, Stout, FarmWise, Verdant, Nio. Those are all large Salinas Valley presence, getting larger, some of them homegrown. And I think those are big opportunities on the Central Coast. Remember, macro level, we're a $50 billion state for ag. We're a $4 billion county in GDP for ag. And so that's an awful lot of fruits and veg that we need to get weeded and harvested, and labor's tough. Last point is AI will leverage all these massive data sets from the equipment makers going around the fields and deliver actionable recommendations. It's starting to happen already for what to plant, when to apply inputs. If that sounds like a great test case for artificial intelligence and all the AI magic we've seen in the last year and a half really emerge at scale, it is. So again, for entrepreneurial opportunity, I think next to biologicals, automation solves a real problem and has both hardware and software components that need solving and can get capital. So that's a little bit on ag and ag tech.
Fantastic, Walt. It's just clear messaging and great analysis. I look forward to your what are you going to do? A regular what do they call the recording?
Podcast.
Podcast. Yes, do a podcast because
I'm a perfect podcast guest, Josh. They're a lot of work.
Yeah, well, you do a great job, and yeah, I think the mixing bowls analysis here are helpful. I did search those out and put the links in the chat for everyone. And
Thank you.
I mean, ag drives the Central Coast economy. So I think I've heard discussions with a number of folks over the years, but one of the things, with ag being sort of a driven by major infrastructure and land ownership and all of that, one of the areas of opportunity for folks who are not already embedded in that space are these innovation segments, with especially with the robotics and all of that. We're big fans of that. And that's where there's operation and maintenance opportunities for growing companies, manufacturing, and so I think that represents, from where I sit anyhow, that's a drum we beat on quite a bit, is just supporting with a workforce that has robotics, mechatronics expertise, and operation and maintenance. There's growing demand, and so I think just great to hear that perspective from you, Walt. Thanks for making the time. And I put some links in the chat for folks who may want to follow up with Walt.